I'm Evan Wolff, attorney at Crowell LLP. I co-chair the Privacy and Cyber Practice Group. And this is, I guess, a few years of us hosting, the event now called Critical Effects. So thank you very much for coming. And it's always an honor to be a part of the show. So now that we've had our photo ops done, I want to thank everyone on the panel for being willing participants to join in what has really been a social experiment of mine and some of our collective friends for a while around solving a problem that's pretty eminent, but also on a bit of a longer timeline and a shorter timeline at the same time, hence the use of the term multiverse. We have a problem as a nation in that we aren't very good at thinking ahead of how we develop regulations until we actually need them. And if we look at events like 9/11 and standing up the Department of Homeland Security or the Patriot Act, we don't really think, okay, let's think about how we would defend our entire aviation system, or let's think about how we defend, against terrorism until we actually have an event, and then we put together something very quickly. And to be honest, it kind of sucks. Yeah. And so the journey we're going to be on for the next 45 or 50 minutes is how do we create something in advance of a bad event? And let's think about the multiple timelines. Once again, I'm a huge Loki fan that we can take to do that. And so really, we're going to start off in this event. Our panel has two parts to it. We're going to start with our origin stories, as any good superhero talk does, because we all got here in very different ways, and we all think about cyber policy and regulation in different ways. And then we're going to pick 4 regulatory models that we've been sort of debating now for a little while, and I've been debating for a little longer, and we're going to talk about that. So I'll end with my origin story last, and we're going to start with Jeanette first.
I wasn't ready for my origin story. So yeah, well, I think you know. So my name is Jeanette Manfra. I run risk and compliance and privacy for Google Cloud. And I've been there for 5.5 years. Before that, I spent really long time at DHS building CISA. And before that, I was in the Army. So I guess my origin story in kind of coming to here, I enlisted in the Army in a previous decade. And I enlisted as what was called a signal system support specialist. And so I was a mix between a land administrator, which they didn't tell me in recruiting, and the person who had to fix radios. And so, but it was a really cool job. And then I went into intelligence and spent a few years in the Army doing that. And so it was really late 90s, early 2000s. And when after Iraq, when I came back to the US, things had changed so dramatically. And so I ended up in the cybersecurity space because of my interest and experience on the intelligence side, but also as someone who deeply understood communication systems and the threat to those. And I got sort of tricked into working with CISA. and it was actually even at the time when we couldn't agree whether cybersecurity was one word or 2 words. I don't know if you guys remember that. There was a lot of debate actually about that, way more than you would imagine. And but I saw it as this really interesting space that was pulling together so many threats and risks and this dynamic between industry and government, that it was fundamentally changing the way we think about how government and industry works together. And so that was really what got me fascinated by it. And then the policy of having a non-intelligence, non-regulatory agency that was solely focused on defense and on the civilian side, I also believed and still believe very passionately that was the right policy. And so that's sort of how I came to it, and learned a lot along the way. But I think fundamentally, I still believe in those original concepts, though I think we've been challenged in implementing them.
Andy?
All right. Thanks, Evan. Randy Sabett. I am special counsel at Cooley, part of our cyber data privacy practice. My origin story, so I sort of started life as a crypto engineer at NSA, somewhat by accident. There was a sign-up sheet I went to Syracuse University. There was a sign-up sheet in the office, and it sounded interesting. And there were only a few slots that people had, written in. And I wound up getting 2 job offers as a sales engineer, and I am not a salesperson. And over a period of time, got courted and joined the fort. Spent several years doing PKI related stuff, as I like to say. I was doing PKI before people knew how to spell it. But it was, a lot of fun, very cool stuff. In one project, there was a guy who would come in and would start these simulations that would take hours, and he'd pull out these thick books. And I said to him, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm going to law school. And I'd been planning all along to do a master's, wasn't thinking at all about law, and wound up going to law school and sort of changing from this person who is so focused down at the bit level. For those of you who know computer stuff, I was doing assembly language programming to do exponentiations in PKI. I went from that to becoming an attorney and focusing in on all the subjects we're going to be discussing in a little while. How I came to this part of it, I was in the ABA for several years. I was a part of the digital signature guidelines, so I was a code reporter for that. Did the PKI assessment guidelines, so did a bunch of stuff that was policy folks, but again, fairly technical. And then was asked to be on the Commission for Cybersecurity for the 44th presidency, which was, I wouldn't say a transition, but it was my first real exposure to these kinds of issues. And as Evan said, and as we'll talk about, to some extent, I would say, and this is all just my opinion, but I would say the system is broken, but it's because cyber is very different than just about any other regulatory area. I'd never say any other, but most other regulatory areas don't involve something that cuts across a whole bunch of different verticals that are all different, not just size of the company, not just number of transactions, not just revenue, but information they handle, sensitive information, personal information. When you have that, sort of the horizontal is cyber cutting across all of these, how do you come up with a regulatory model that works? We've got several examples where it hasn't. And I would actually assert that if we sort of pick and choose from things that work and sort of weave them together, we might have something that, does work this time. So anyway, to you.
Ms. Stifel.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Megan Stifel. I am the Chief Strategy Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology. So we're one of the co-sponsors, co-something or others of this event. And I've been at IST for almost 3.5 years. Prior to IST, like I guess everybody else on this panel, I would argue that I started my career almost in national security. I was a Hill staffer actually in August of 1998, which we'll come back to a little bit later. For those of you who don't remember, that was the month that Al-Qaeda hit the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And I was like, oh, and so by chance, there was a job posting because I was in a personal office on the House side nursing. And there was a job posting that said, subcommittee seeks staff assistant, must pass security clearance. And I was like, oh, what's that? I don't know, I'll apply. Well, guess what? It was the House Intelligence Committee. So I was there for 2.5 years and looked around and I was like, oh, all these people who are making decisions and having influence are all lawyers. I should go to law school and not go to become like a PhD in international development. So I went off to law school and was fortunate that I then during law school was an intern in the then Office of Intelligence Policy and Law. No, Office of Intelligence Policy and Review, sorry, OIPR, which no longer exists. It's now the Office of Intelligence, and it's been subsumed into the National Security Division, which didn't exist in 1998. Anyways, I was in law school for obviously 3 years. And the then head of the office, when I finished my internship, said to me, you will always have a job here, but you should go off and try this real lawyer thing. And the person was Jim Baker, who, among other things, then became the general counsel of FBI. But I was like, okay, I'll follow Jim's advice. Well, I then got tricked into being a regulatory attorney, which I didn't know when I accepted the job at the law firm. I thought I was going to be doing one type of regulatory work, which would be OFAC and anti-boycott and the issues around commodities trading. And then I ended up having to do state and local like wholesale registration stuff, which made me want to gouge my eyes out. I will wrap this up. I was sitting on the bus riding to work, and I think it was July 6th, the day that you'll see the terrorism kind of focuses centers around my life. It was the day that the tube bombing happened, and I was like, what am I doing here? I don't belong doing this like registration stuff to make another, I'm not going to name who, some like large bank more money. I should go off and follow my passion. So anyways, I went back to the Office of Intelligence, which was then the Office of Intelligence, and was at DOJ for almost 10 years and was fortunate to be in the wrong place at the right time or the right place at the wrong time. And so had the opportunity to do not only FISA work on against a set of targets that are now covered under law, new form of law. It's no longer new, 702, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Amendments Act. And then because the body of law that applies to intelligence collection also helps us think about cybersecurity, I went over and did some policy work and then ended up at the NSC. And then left government, and I don't live here anymore. I just told you all a secret. I live in Charleston, and fortunate to work for IST. So, and we're doing a range of things, including cyber.
Thank you. Well, hopefully everyone understands now why I'm using my superhero analogy, because we truly have a bunch of superheroes here. And my superpower then is I have great fucking friends. So thank you all for agreeing to come here and be part of my thought experiment. But more importantly, I guess just quickly, Evan Wolff. I start off life as similar to Randy, as a data scientist for the government, background in a master's in physics and numerical modeling, and did some interesting work for the government overseas building secure comms, and then was voluntold by my mentor, who directed me often in life, Dr. Schlesinger, the chairman of MITRE's board, to go work at the Department of Homeland Security, or what was the start of it. I'd been in between starting a red team program for MITRE and really enjoyed being a red teamer, but it was sort of a crazy lifestyle, as some of you know who work in that space, especially in the late 90s. And so I wandered over to DHS when it was the Office of Homeland Security, met Governor Ridge, ended up being the secretary, and was there through the first secretary chart off the first transition, and largely my entire time before that, and then was working on what is now cyber policy. I got to work on the PDD 63, just since we're all dating ourselves, PDD 63, which was sort of the first of the infrastructure policy initiatives that we got. And I was there through HSPD 7, and then thankfully did the handoff with Megan and some of the other people that worked on the other policy transitions, in Jeanette. So I've seen the concept of critical infrastructure go from a coalition of the willing, and it wasn't even really the willing, it was the coalition of the uninformed, because many companies back then, when we had 16 sectors and 2 key resources, because that's how we stole the definition from DOJ, I guess borrowed with some intent, and we really didn't understand what it meant to be critical infrastructure, and that's the value proposition that I think to transition to what our panel is going to be about. It's really that understanding. I mean, if you were in, for example, another country, let's say People's Republic of China, critical infrastructure there is often state-owned and really is managed, and it's very clear that they are critical infrastructure. But here, it could be everything from Google to one of the facilities that Josh Corman and others are talking about, municipal water facilities. So it's really, like everything in the U.S., one of our biggest problems is our scale and our success. And so what I really want to do, and we're each going to pick for the rest of the format, is really, we picked sort of 4 different regulatory models that one of us is going to be the introducer of. And once again, when I'm not lawyering, I'm a professor at Columbia University with a couple other superheroes, Charles Carmichael and Jay Healy. And so we have a lecture similar to this that I've adapted. And so we're each going to pick a model and we're going to introduce it, and then we're all going to sort of politely agree and disagree with each other, or in my case, not so polite. So starting off with Jeanette.
Awesome. All right. So I'm going to focus on regulatory, or let's call it regulatory adjacent, where industry is self-certifying and using different standards. And so largely because this is where I spend a fair amount of my time, I run all of our certifications. And I think, from my perspective, there's a lot of pros in this space and a fair amount of opportunities, but it is the predominant way that this is sort of voluntary engagement, voluntary self-certification, sometimes using a third-party auditor, oftentimes a requirement through procurement or vendor assessments. But it is the most prevalent way that, in particular, software and other vendors in that space are we'll call it regulated. And what I would say is that when I was in CISA, we spent a lot of time thinking about incentives and risk, and why are we not seeing market drivers happen in the way that you would expect? Why do the things happen after a big breach or not happen that you would expect? Why is there not more demand from consumers, from shareholders, from customers for evidence of better security? And sorry, did I? Okay. I know. And so we really believe that if you sort of pushed on the various different levers, the regulatory environment, when you start getting into critical infrastructure, you're talking about all these different sector base and all that. And so thought, okay, well, let's really align on standards, the NIST framework and things like that. But the reality, now sitting on the other side is these frameworks and maybe start at the top. There is no clear standard of care that a company can benchmark against. And that is really challenging, both for industry, for customers, shareholders, for sort of larger market, for government. And there's also two things that get conflated, because when you're talking about critical infrastructure, critical for what? And so what national or regional or other sort of systemic risk are we talking about? And then there's just a desire to have better security overall. And those two conversations often get conflated and make things challenging for companies to navigate. So yes, there are a lot of many great standards, and for many multinational companies you have to try to meet them all, and you have to try to triangulate all these different bits of work, but how much assurance does that give you internally on your security posture? How much assurance does that give customers, and how much is that actually filling in these gaps where the government should be rightly concerned about systemic risk that is cutting across sectors? I think that there is likely not something that we're going to be able to solve exclusively through standards-based approach. That was my 5 minutes, maybe longer. Oh, am I teeing it? I forgot who I'm teeing it up for. Evan.
Yes, I guess just one point on that concept of self-regulation is, does it work on its own? I mean, is this like a spontaneous, combustion issue of one day companies like we saw with PCI DSS, where they're just going up and say, oh, let's all come together and spend millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to, restrict our business model so we can all be safer and more secure, which is what happened many years ago with PCI DSS. Does there need to be an external stressor on the system for self-regulation to work? I think, well, you're poised like a jaguar to grab your mic and answer the question, so I'll let you do it. my old and wise friend.
So I'll throw Evan under the bus here. I rarely see him not speechless, but sort of stopped. And as we were preparing for this, so as I said earlier, I think there are good parts of all of the different things that we're going to talk about, but no one thing right now works. With PCI DSS, I agree that you've got an industry standard that people have gathered around sort of independently or without regulation. But I said, have you ever heard of a company that has been found in violation of PCI that did not have a breach? I open it to the floor. Anyone?
The other way around. Everyone fails a post-breach audit.
No, that's true. That's the one we always talk about. After a breach and there's an audit, oh yeah, this person didn't do that, or I'm sorry, this institution didn't do this. But you never hear, and it's possible that this just is under the radar, but it would seem like you would hear about an entity that has, gone through the PCI process and fails their audit. And it's a post-event kind of thing that they fail an audit, or that there is a problem with what they've done. So I think I'm going to sort of do a read ahead here at some of the stuff I'm going to cover, but I think if we look at these different regulatory approaches, the ones that really have some teeth are the ones where there's enforcement. So there's regulation, which is good, but it's the enforcement that makes it really stick. I don't think we need to go down the list here, but how many regulatory models in this space are out there where there really isn't there really isn't enforcement, and so therefore it's not that it's ignored. We'll talk about HIPAA in a little bit, and there've obviously been some major HIPAA breaches, but we're not at a point yet where the enforcement in some of these self-regulated areas really works.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to push back gently on that, because in 2013, DoD created a cybersecurity regulation. It was put into the DFARS. 7012 clause required companies to report incidents within 72 hours and have adequate security. Well, I actually handled Crowell, and I was at near the beginning of my time here at Crowell, we handled one of the first reportable incidents to DoD. I happen to know the DoD CIO, and I got a call within a few minutes saying, so which of the controls of the 110 controls at a NIST 800 171 did you not implement? Where was your compliance fault? To which I said, none. We had a spear phishing attack. There's no regulation that says you shall never get spear phished ever again. That's not in NIST 800 171. That's not in any document anywhere. And so for DoD to come to us and say, and get taken over by a big blob, and for DoD to come to us and say, if you had an incident, you must not be in compliance, was fundamentally not true. So I agree, there's a difference between a policy challenge, which is what I think DoD set up, and a technology issue, which is where PCIS DSS. So just to prove lawyers can agree on things every now and then, Randy and I are in agreement. So, but you want to make some points. I distracted you. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, the only other thing to respond to what you just said, from a breadth issue, and it was the conversation I think at RSA around information sharing. There's this panel up there, brilliant people, financial services. They know everything inside and out about cyber in financial services, and they had this discussion. And it's like, okay, that's great, but you're talking about, how small. I'm sorry, this was regulated financial institutions. And so there are all of these, you mentioned thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of other companies that are out there. And I would say, to your point, it's a great example, but it's only in the government contracting space. So I think the challenge here is to take these different pieces and expand them across that whole universe of, everyone who's affected by cyber, who, that's anyone who's online and connected.
And just to interrupt for a second, Randy's use of the word only impacts companies in cyber. That's 221,286 companies that are regulated. So that's I guess a tiny only in your world. In my world, that's pretty big. But I do want to quickly talk about outcome-based regulations for a minute, because I think that's the next sort of model that we had discussed, and one that's often been bantered about has absolutely nothing to do with cyber, but the Oil Pollution Act. And the oil pollution came about after there was a great and very unfortunate accident where a single hold vessel carrying too much oil at night, after there had been people that had been drinking repeatedly, not sleeping, and ran in and caused an accident that was both historic and unfortunate. And so, scientists got together with environmental regulators, and they came up with fundamentally a law that does two things. The Oil Pollution Act, it requires you to have double hold vessels, because at the time we had a very simple technology that actually prevented oil spills, not having a single hold vessel, but just having two holes so you can puncture one without the other. And we're having insurance that's based on the amount of oil that you're shipping. And so isn't there very similar cyber analogies to this? So, right now, and I about a month ago, I did an incident where it's a very small company. It had less than 20 employees, and they had millions of records on their network and at their storage. I guarantee you, whatever insurance they had, which I purposely did not ask them, I guess that's a commentary on the legal industry, but let's walk away from that slowly, isn't commensurate with the risk that they pose. And that's the issue of how do we balance risk versus infrastructure versus the actual data on networks or data on systems that we have never been able to get that right. And so once again, we can wait for an equivalent of, a great oil spill in the Exxon Valdez, or we can figure out maybe companies should have a certain amount of regulation. And I'm glad I'm farthest away from Jeanette when I say this. The larger the company's data footprint is, the more insurance they should have. And smaller companies or companies that have less data, this would be a great way of reducing networks and reducing data stores. But I think there is, for some sectors, and to Randy's point, or as my boss at DHS used to say, when you see one sector, you've seen one sector. I don't think we can apply a regulation to all of them. I don't think Google can be seen the same as a rural water facility. And I think we all agree on that. So anyway, but over to you, Professor Sabett. I think you were next.
Before you go, because I think I want to highlight an important point that I think you guys both kind of talked about both aspects. One is those most critical entities that pose significant risk that could have an impact like the Exxon did. Not every company can have that sort of impact on the security of our country. And I do think there needs to be a more focused understanding and a different approach for those organizations that can have a significantly consequential impact, and therefore they have a higher level of responsibility. And that doesn't mean that you say, the 20-person company with millions of record is devoid of responsibility. But I think it needs to be a different conversation in what is the standard of care for every organization. By the way, I'm not a lawyer, so if I use any lawyerly terms incorrectly, just let me know. But what does that look like so that we can continue to hold people accountable for doing what they're supposed to be doing for their customers, for whatever it might be. And then those organizations that can have that significant consequential impact need to have I believe, a higher set of responsibilities. Now, the thing that gets difficult is our supply chains are so complicated, and our technological dependencies. Well, there's both opportunity and difficulty here. In many systems, I'm using the term systems very broadly here, you actually might have a 20-person company that is a single point of failure for some process that poses systemic risk in an overall sector. And so we need to understand what those are. So it's not to say that you can just look at a large company and say, they're responsible for fixing XYZ, and then we're going to be okay. You do need to, and by you, I really think there's a responsibility for the government working with industry to be able to understand what does systemic risk look like, I mean, financial services is a little bit farther ahead only because they've had so many issues with exposing systemic risk. But what does it look like there? And then what should those organizations be doing above and beyond as a result of their outsized level of responsibility, which I think might go into more sectors.
As we transition, reminding ourselves that at one point Google was a 20-person company, but let's not go too far down the multiverse and go over to Randy.
So I've already previewed a number of different things in talking about approaches that are what we've got here is outcome-based regulations based on regulating incidents that include criminal and civil penalties. And I think that the real focus of that is what is the incentive for complying with any kind of regulation from a cyber perspective. We can talk about proactive incentives, and we've had a number of different laws that have tried to do that. Again, back to RSA, the one that had come up in a session that we were at RSA was CISA 2015, the Information Sharing Act. I and several other the folks that we run in circles with thought this is going to be awesome. These small companies that have really important information on various breaches are going to be sharing it with bigger companies and with the government, and we're all going to get better. And it didn't happen, right? There were incentives there. There's this awesome liability avoidance incentive in the law. And it was like, nah. I mean, some people took advantage of it and did it, but not on the scale that I think we had hoped, and certainly not on the scale that we need for this kind of stuff. The examples that I jotted down in thinking about this and talking through it, first of all, we've got DFS, which has the financial cyber regs associated with it. And I jotted down the SEC cyber rules, which are the new rules that have come out from the SEC. I use those two examples to sort of point to what I was saying earlier about here's a couple of good things. With DFS, why is DFS different than any, the mass regs or some of the California regs? What DFS does,
it's in New York, obviously.
Exactly. Both of us from New York. It's something that is backed by heavy duty enforcement. I meant before this to look up the last team of people that I dealt with there, and I didn't. But if you are at all involved with DFS, you would know these folks because they are they're not, I won't use any expletives, but they're not those kind, but they're very good at what they do. They know technology. It's not just lawyers or some of those lawyers and yeah, or folks that know technology. They bring in both. They bring in the legal team along with the tech team right next to them, and they go through in gory detail. And when I prep my clients for a DFS inquiry, it's very different than, Indiana or some other state. Nothing against Indiana. It's really the enforcement piece that makes people pay attention and improve their security and want to have their security meeting proactively the requirements so they don't get it on the back end. The SEC cyber rules, for those of you who have dealt with them, they are not only does the SEC take action against companies, civil action for violation, there are also criminal penalties that can come into play. And you talk to most folks in public companies, and the ones that we deal with, and that's something that they definitely do not want to deal with. And so it's an incentive, negative incentive, to improve their security. So I think the commonality here is there are things that the regulators are doing or powers that they have that prompt companies to comply. It's, with all due respect to the self-compliance, it's not a voluntary activity, it's a mandatory activity, but it's a mandatory activity that has teeth to it.
Yeah, I mean, I adore you as a friend, but I feel bad for your universe, because what you're saying is that without enforcement, there is no compliance, and that companies wouldn't, just as we have a company representative, do the right thing because that's the right thing to do. And while, if I were speaking as a partner in a global law firm that has both a large compliance and a large defense practice, I would probably want to agree with you, but I can't, because we have many models where companies, in fact, I think the rule, not the exception, is that companies do comply with regulations, even in absence of strong enforcement programs. So, I agree enforcement makes everything easier, makes sort of our jobs easier to sell compliance. Being a fear monger is certainly like an easier way of waking up and putting on really cool socks every day and going to work. But in reality, since the coolest shoes on the panel are from the person who works at a company, Jeanette, and don't worry, you have the coolest glasses on the panel. We all have our attributes. But
So
large companies have compliance without having to, always think about, okay, I'm not going to invest in this today because I'm not going to worry about being whacked. And so I agree that enforcement needs to be a part of a future cyber regulation, but it can't be the beginning and the end. And we need to figure out the sort of the hard part, especially when we talk about quantum and AI, because we have to talk about that at least once during every panel we're on, is how are we going to create sort of business incentives where it doesn't become such a challenge, but it becomes something that they could actually maybe not lose money off of. I'm not going to be so heuristic to say they'll make money on it. And so, I do think that, as with everything you say, there's some truth, but there's something I disagree with too. But over to the cool
Just
glasses.
really quickly, because I think a lot of times we forget the point of compliance. And I resisted becoming a compliance person for a little while. But we have to remember that the purpose of regulation, right, is usually to fill a gap that the market is not naturally filling, right? And then the purpose of compliance, or at least my assessment of the purpose of compliance, is to be able to demonstrate that you're achieving some objective. And whether that's through, just take my reputation and I'm going to self-assert that I'm going to do that, or have some independent way of looking at it. And so this is why I kind of keep coming back to the purpose is, if you are doing compliance just for compliance sake, you forget the security outcomes that you're trying to achieve. If you're regulating just for regulatory sake, you're forgetting the original risk that you were trying to mitigate. And I feel like this is where we are right now, is everybody has vague and different interpretations of risk. And so regulators and compliance people go, well, I mitigate risk. I'm here to do that. And so there's sort of a hodgepodge of things going on, but we've sort of forgotten the point. And I deal with a lot of compliance obligations that come in various fronts that I'm like, what is the point of this? And sometimes the regulator can tell me what the intent is. Sometimes they can't. And they'll just say, well, it's just, in the list of things to do. And those put a lot of burden on companies that aren't going towards actual security outcomes. So that's just my sermon of, we got to remember to, like, there's an outcome that we're trying to achieve. And if you're not precise, are we trying to prevent the Exxon Valdez of cyber, or are we just trying to make sure that, the consumer isn't defrauded every time they try to log in, or both? Because there's going to be different policy approaches. Anyway.
With that precision of mind, Megan, can you?
Oh, excuse me. So I am did you hear the word regulatory attorney in my current title? No. I'm the one who's left bringing up the rear, which means A, all the smart things were already said, but B, I get to talk about things that I have no knowledge of. So I'm loosely going to describe, but then call upon my friends to describe the traditional command and control regulatory model. Based on sector and market size, where there are NIST standards and regulatory agencies assigned to each. Since Josh is here, but he's hiding behind the pole, there he is. The example here is HIPAA. Well, if you've been listening at all today, did you see the groan on his face? Are we actually achieving security or privacy via HIPAA? Anybody know what EPIC is? I think we have a problem. And yet, I live in Charleston. I go to multiple doctors' offices, different hospital systems. They are all running Epic. And I'm like, oh my God, my friend Josh has talked to me about this. I'm screwed. And so is my data because it doesn't have private. Anyway, so I would say, I'm going to fight the scenario here a bit to say and echo Jeanette's remarks because I feel like she was like, I did write this on Google. I don't know. What is the problem?
You have control over your own data.
Yes, I know it says that in the fine print. Finally, what is the problem we're trying to solve for here? If the thing we're trying to solve for is to make sure that the hospital system is stable and patient information is available to the doctors who need it when they're about to perform surgery or otherwise examine a patient, is HIPAA the right model? I don't know that it is. So I don't love this model, and that's why I'm now looking at you if you want to try and save it. But otherwise, I'm going to say I think I agree with Randy that we need to be borrowing from what works. At the same time, we also need to avoid the bring a rock scenario, where it's like, oh, I'm your regulator. Show me your compliance, and you're like, well, this is what I did. It was pick your NIST regulation. No, not that one. You didn't. You got it's ISO. Well, not that one because you didn't XYZ. So I'm not a regulatory attorney. I said that 4 times already just to convince you all. But I think the other thing that I want us to think about and encourage all of you to think about is whether is regulation the right incentive. We are talking on a regulatory panel, but there are other incentives out there. And back to Jeanette's opening remarks about what is the purpose of regulation is to address a market gap. Can we move to a place where the market is properly incentivized? And I know Evan's going to jump in here because he says incentives don't work. Well, I don't know. Where the market is properly incentivized and where companies are factoring security into their profit models and making money off of being more secure. So,
first of all, let the record reflect. I never said incentives don't work. They just don't work all the time in every sector.
Okay.
I think. But the point of regulation, which I think pointed out, I view it a little differently. I mean, we go back to environmental economists, it's to internalize externalities. And here the externality is, secure networks, secure data, and maybe better life cycle management of data. So, every company, every data breach I work on doesn't end up having, 10 petabytes of data for the last 20 years, because that's a huge problem. And so if we could, get companies to internalize those externalities, and I do believe that we can NIST our way out of this. I'm also an advocate of using NIST as a verb. So I think we can NISTify our way through this if we develop right standards. And I think standards we've seen with CSF and elsewhere, they can be developed in a peer-based way that is effective. And so, we do have these moments in time, whether it's DSF or CSF. I guess they all have a lot of SFs in them. And
security framework, for those who don't know what he means by.
Oh, sorry, the NIST security framework, which came together over a 5-city tour over a couple years, and now is probably the most prolific. I have the 5-city tour T-shirt. I think many of you do as well. With most prolific voluntary standard used by industry, whether
it's not a standard.
Voluntary framework. Sorry.
Possible to comply. Even not forget voluntary.
That's Alan Friedman in the front row for those of you who are watching online. If you can. So I want to jump in on this standards comment, because those of you who were not here this morning missed Congressman Begich saying, and I hope I pronounced that properly, all respect due, don't rely on the government. We need to prioritize standards. Right, but government can set the environment for standards to succeed or fail, and
or frameworks.
So I think what we need here on the standards point is for the government to say, we believe in this and we're going to show up for you, industry, because we saw what happened. Jeanette and I were working together in the early 2010s, and there was a withdrawal, I would say, from US leadership in some of the standards organizations. Well, guess who filled that gap? China and Huawei. And here we are. So I think, yes, we shouldn't always look to government to solve the problem, but I think we do depend on government to set the conditions. And I hope that this particular Congress and this administration will continue to focus on setting the standards, which do involve an innovation forward approach, but it doesn't mean complete withdrawal.
But I want to say you're very good on the economics there. Since this is very focused on the critical infrastructure, I want to keep pushing back on the externalities that are being experienced are where there isn't a single organization that is responsible for managing the risk to our country or to a region. That's the problem. I agree with you that there's lots of work that can be done to raise the bar and the requirement. And I do believe actual standards that can be put in place and through a variety of different mechanisms for companies to be able to be held accountable for those. But there's, I think, a more serious externality or public good, you might call it, where it's the commons effect, right? And that's, I think, where the government would do well to focus their efforts is where are those? How is the system potentially at risk because there's no clear handoff in whatever that process is? And would regulations fix it? I think too often we sort of drive to, yes, oh, let's just do a regulation. It might not, but that's where, just because this is sort of trying to focus on critical infrastructure, spending so long on the critical infrastructure problem in the government, we've just created it as like, well, there's everything is critical infrastructure. And then to what end are we driving towards? So I just think that's the externality that is not being cared for.
And we have a 2-minute warning, and then one of our panelists is going to leave. What Jeanette's going to leave. Well, the rest of us will stay, and we'll go into Q&A in 2 minutes. So if you can give us 2 more minutes, and then we'll turn to Josh. And I do want to comment on Josh's HIPAA problem, which I think is a problem. Well, but go ahead, Randy.
No, I just wanted to tie together a couple of different things. So first of all, my earlier rant, if you want to call it that, about enforcement versus regulatory, take that back to what I said at the very beginning. I'm not saying that's the only solution. And I don't think this is an either this or that problem. It's a, multiverse kind of gets there, but it's a multidimensional issue. And to think that the government could come in with a regulation that applies to all companies and raises the bar is a non-starter. I'm, again, playing with this bingo card thing here with, like, up in the top left corner, you have Cooley deals with hundreds of startups. None of my clients that are startups could put in place like 171 or anything else that is just overwhelming from a security perspective. But if there's some sort of self-regulatory approach that would work for them that does not necessarily have enforcement, maybe that would work, or maybe some sort of light regulation. But think about those different squares and how you could get down to the bottom right with companies that are dealing with highly sensitive information, whether it's PII or national security information, and have a massive infrastructure and lots of money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're going to should be held to a different standard. Where that is, I think, is the challenge here.
So, but all your startups could buy GCP or GCC High, or, to be ecumenical, any of the other FedRAMP moderate solutions that allow them to comply with NIST 800-171 just by making smart purchasing decisions, just to make friends at the end of the...
And Google Cloud.
But I do want to be respectful, because there's family obligations here. So I want to take a second and thank Jeanette as she departs the panel. And the rest of us are going to stay, and we'll go into, remember your mug, and the rest of us will stay, and we're going to go into Q&A, lots of questions around the room. And I do want to just, and I'll start off with Josh and sort of my take on Josh's HIPAA problem, because I do think there is a HIPAA problem, in that we sit behind this Potemkin village of HIPAA thinking that it is going to secure the entire healthcare system. It wasn't designed to do that. The Clean Air Act doesn't help moderate us from nuclear waste or oil spills. HIPAA isn't going to help us solve the supply chain issue, the data storage issue, the facility issue that we have, and all the other problems. And so we do need to either unpack, destroy, rewrite, or re-engineer HIPAA. And that's Josh.
All right, my point's slightly different, and it was actually a conversation I had with Jeanette when she was in the White House, NSC. Statement question. We contradict ourselves a lot when we have these public-private debates, and even in the same, even in EO 14028, the commentary from certain trade associations in one round said we want it all the same and harmonized, and then it says no, we want beautiful, unique snowflakes. No, we want it harmonized. There's a couple ways I think we have to advance the conversation, and it could be ex ante and ex post. It could be, are we focused on the controls that if you do these, then we have a prescriptive checklist? Or do we want to be risk-based where we make a decision? If we get it wrong, we pay for it. You know, are we regulating inputs or outcomes? And then the second part is, second scoping dimension could be, there's a fantastic quote we use in SBOM land a lot from the author William Gibson. The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. We actually have pretty concrete safety regulations for medical devices. Europe has some things that we don't have. There are ways to maybe throttle this basically instead of saying all tech, all software, and just say critical infrastructure, that's too big. What about lifeline critical infrastructure? So like there's ways to bound concentric rings of let's have more trustworthy and transparency in digital infrastructure that can kill people or affect national security than we do for blogs or WordPress. And we tend to like lump everything together, and we say one size doesn't fit all, and then we keep having a one size fits all debate. So I guess all out that said is, are there ways to scope or segment how we apply an ex ante and ex post and outcomes versus inputs? Can we introduce more stringent requirements when it's safety directed versus privacy directed or just monetarily directed? How do you eat this elephant? Liability is clean.
So, I mean, I think so we spoke about some of these things earlier. I'll just sort of point to some of them, I think, which are important here that, you know, first of all, we can create, there is no one size fits all approach. We need to think about, you know, critical infrastructure sectors differently based on size and composition. I think what we've learned from, and I'll point to the sort of the ultimate standard that we got wrong until we got it right, the Clean Air Act. You know, when the Clean Air Act was passed in 1973, literally, if you read every article, every sort of environmental and economics article, they said it was going to cost industry 7 to 9% of global energy costs would go to just complying with this one standard. Today, it's lost in the nines. Even though scrubbers on a natural instance, where today we started building natural gas and coal fire stacks again, the scrubber on the top of a stack can cost up to $500 million. But that is lost in the energy costs and the efficiencies we get out of it, because those scrubbers actually make those facilities more efficient. And we created these technology forcing regulations, and we're able to sort of regulate our way around it. So there are solutions out there that we have to sort of think of adopting, but it can't just be, and I think we've all agree on this, it can't just be create a regulation or create a strong enforcement mechanism. We need to be, you know, we need this isn't a case where we can use a hammer. Since Josh's name is here, we have to use the word hammer at one point, but we need to take a scalpel, you know, to these regulations and these enforcement programs.
I'm going to pound on what Josh said. Sorry about that. Stand back here. All right, solution, Niemeyer. I want to jump on the safety. That's been the problem with our security policy over the last 20 years in this country. We're not talking human safety. Regulations in every critical infrastructure sector are built around human safety. We keep talking security. You all spend 45 minutes talking about data security without addressing the core risk with the critical infrastructure. They can kill people. They can cause property damage. Until we start as an organization, start talking about safety, standard of care, which was admitted by Jeanette before she left. We have 200 years of engineering history in this country of building standards of care around how we design mechanical systems, electrical systems, how we design civil systems, fire controls. That's all built around safety. We have to change, starting today, the narrative about a new framework, a new standard, new policy around what is needed for a standard of care for the cyber safety of a system, whether it be software, whether it be a device, whether it be anything, and then drive that truck home for this country, not in a regulatory sense, but once you start talking safety, that's a CEO liability. That is non-waiverable. That is non-negotiable. That's not, value engineered away as like cybersecurity is. That has to be mandatory. So we really do need to change and love to come together on recommendations on how we start promoting a standard of care for cyber safety in each sector.
Yeah. So I agree. I think one sort of footnote I'll make to that is I recently spent 6 months looking at FAA cyber infrastructure, and what I learned from that experience, other than the fact that I am scared of flying now, is that the FAA has perfected a safety culture. It is a safety culture that has redundancies on redundancies. It's why we have, by a factor of over 2, the largest aviation system in the country and the safest. Because even with 2,600 baud modems that are used in our FAA infrastructure, which is actually a truthful fact, we still have the ability to perform those safety checks through human and information systems. When we think about security at the FAA, that's a whole different problem. And I'm not going to discuss any of the recommendations, but the FAA is exempt from any of the traditional government contracts, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the FAR. They don't have to impose any of the security regulations that other federal agencies do. And so they have actually the inverse problem. And I think there's a lot to be learned from doing a study of places like the FAA where they have a strong safety culture. And I would argue, not based on my time on Project Vector, not a strong security regulation. Sorry, FAA, if you're listening.
So this is Michael Klein from IST. I was the NSM 22 person for education. So I wish Jeanette were still here because we did that conversation, obviously, about what is critically important infrastructure, who counts, and what can rise to that level. And we were always told, unfortunately, because people don't die in schools, when you have an incident, you guys aren't really going to count, right? So I think that there is a sector by sector piece of this. And another part of it is, I'm wondering if there are ways that you've seen impact on systemically important vendors in a sector by sector way, because there are about 20 vendors that can shut down school districts because of the number of districts that use them. It's Google, Microsoft, and about 18 sector-specific organizations. And so if you can't send kids to school on their bus, or you can't get kids safely home or feed them, you can't do school, and you can impact that at scale. So I guess I wonder, are there ways that you think we might approach a sectorally based, critically important entity kind of approach?
I'll go back to what I know, which is sort of, because I spent a lot of the last 15 years working on it, which is how DoD regulates things. And out of that 221,000 companies that I talked about earlier, the vast majority of them are not spending hundreds of millions of dollars or even millions of dollars. The vast majority of them have to do 15 things, have MFA, check for vulnerabilities, do what we used to call cyber hygiene, I guess, back in the 2000s. I guess we don't talk about that anymore. And those things can be done very easily. There is a risk. There's the Fear of False Claims Act and all these other sort of odious things that the things that the government can do. But so if we make standards or a framework easy enough to comply with, then companies would do it. I mean, we do this in accounting and other areas. So I think the answer is yes, Blackbaud and others probably do need to have some sort of bare minimum, some datum of security that is enforceable.
But I would add to that if you look at, for example, PCI. So PCI is not just a single set of controls. It's 12 areas with, depending on where a company falls, it's a different set of requirements. So I think to your point, depending on where an entity, company, or whatever other type of entity it might be, sits, and what data they handle, and the damage that could result, I think that's how we get to the type of approach that Evan was describing, where there could be a reasonable set of controls that a company would have to put in place.
True, but PCI is an industry standard. It's not a government regulation.
Yeah.
policy. It comes from the payment card industry deciding this is what we're doing. Similarly, as one of the few Air Force officers, former pilots, and safety officers in the room, I went to mishap investigation school and worked on a few plane crashes. What changed the aviation industry wasn't the FAA creating policy or regulations. It was the airline industries marketing and noticing people don't want to fly anymore because we're crashing. What changed why we wear seatbelts, why people don't drink and drive as much, and why we have airbags in our cars are not because of Department of Transportation and NTSB. It's because of the car companies building them more secure for market advantage. My car is more safe. My minivan's more safe. Buy our car, keep your kids safe. We can hope and pray that the folks down the street come up with a great policy, which CMMC, it's happening. But it's here, and it does do all those things the best that anything can when it's made that way. What would be better is if it was built secure, because they want it in the factory, they want it in the power plant, and you won't put it there if it's not secure.
So I'll jump in here, and not to disagree too much, but we were having these same conversations 20 or 25 years ago. Why hasn't the industry gotten better? And that's a rhetorical question. I don't know that all of those different industries that you described, if those were, all truly just due to marketing. I think there probably was some influence by the government. But in terms of where you're going with this, I don't think companies have seen the need from a marketing or other perspective to have good security. It's like, maybe we talk about it, So if we were getting better over the past 25 years, I'd agree.
I mean, if IBM could only, or Lenovo, sorry, could only sell secure laptops, and I couldn't go to Best Buy and still buy a $300 laptop that's unencrypted, unsecure, and creates, basically, all sorts of problems on the internet, then they would have done that. But there's no requirement for them to do that right now. Well, I don't buy $300 crack tops, and I don't allow any of them in my house. I only buy Mac products because they're secure from the start. Since Google's not here, I can say that now. But you're right. We I guess what I am going to spend the next few years of my life trying to figure out is how can we get to those moments without waiting for the bad thing to happen or waiting for a government to do it all on its own. But we've had patient people.
So
Last question, I think, because,
Yep.
right?
We'll drink soon. I want to pull up something that Randy just said to motivate, because I've been first fantastic to listen to this panel. I've heard all of you speak so many times, and it's great to still hear new ideas of saying we got to work on this. Randy, you said things haven't gotten better, and pushing back on that, software and IT systems are so much better than they used to be for security. One of the things that, not a novel observation, is that security is a dynamic issue which separates it from many other regulatory spaces. And that means that our regulatory paradigms need to be much more dynamic. And so there are sort of three things that I'd love you guys to sort of poke at. One of them is very industry friendly, which is, and aligned with current administration, which I think we need sort of control sniper squads. We need to be able to look at large, existing, complex, multi-control areas and say, that's dumb. We're not going to try to overhaul this law, but we need some ability for consensus driven by industry with some code of process to say, yeah, let's just get rid of that one control out of many. Second, to the point that Josh made earlier, how do we get industry buy-in for a dynamic regulatory environment? if we say, guess what? Next year, you got to do something different than what you did last year. We're going to get pushback. How do we get support by that? And the last piece is in other policy areas, we had until very recently a very widely used concept called program evaluation. Every year there were 50, 100 new PhDs that came out specialized to say, we've just tried to help poor people. We've just tried to teach kids to read better. We've spent a lot of taxpayer money. Did any of it work? How do we build that into our cybersecurity policy and regulation? And I'll be the first to say, the thing that I've spent the last 8 years of my life needs this. We need, someone with a scientific mind to say, hey, SBOM is supposed to be doing these things. Is it actually doing this? And we need this for other emerging cybersecurity areas as well. So how do we build that into our policy frameworks as well?
I mean, I would love to agree with you on your first point that software is getting better, but in the last few years, we've had the greatest, software company in the world and the greatest security company in the world both get hacked. And so I love my Tuesday rituals, but I still think we have Patch Tuesday. And I don't think still one of the hardest requirements in any of the NIST standards for any company to manage is vulnerability management, is identifying what parts of their network need to be patched and patching it. So, I do think and this is where to the end of the last administration and what the national security, what the sort of strategy pointed out is that we really do need to think about putting more pressure on software companies to not release software that is always not ready for prime time. Not that companies would do that, but sometimes that happens. And then sort of using the world as a global test market, because that is, still a challenge. So I do think software security is something we need to think about.
So I wouldn't point to specific breaches. When I say things haven't gotten better, it's, to me, the level that we're at. We're not getting, it's not, what's the phrase about, all boats rise, whatever the phrase is, we collectively, I don't think, have gotten to a point where we can say everyone is doing this thing, and so everybody has gotten better on that part. I agree, there have been a lot of significant improvements in security from a technical perspective, but I don't think everybody's doing it, to Evan's point, the same way, and we're still having, breaches. Now, they're not all the massive kind. Jim Lewis from CSIS was the first person I heard 100 years ago. No, just kidding. Many years, Jim will kill me for that one. Many years ago, bring up the notion of death by 1,000 cuts. Everybody keeps talking the big one. When is the big one going to hit? We've got to prepare ourselves. In the meantime, we're getting $5 million here, $100 million there, 100 million records there. So I think when I say things haven't gotten better, they haven't gotten better, big picture.
Nick wanted to ask a question and I shut him off, but perhaps.
Does that mean I can ask a question?
Quasi-moderator's prerogative.
So Randy, really appreciate the points on enforcement, and Evan, to all of your DoD people. I think one of the challenges from a policy design standpoint is how do we make enforcement that policymakers are okay with, right? How do we not end up saying, in the interest of preventing the bad guys from preventing access to our systems or something else, we're going to shut off that access. And what this looks like is, in the DoD context, is every week I would go to the CRG and there would be some nice new report of a breached contractor, and they got sick of me asking DC3, did that get reported to you? And the answer was 0% of the time was that reported to DC3. So we have DoD, the contractor, and the IC all talking about some breach. and they're in clear violation of the contract and the contractual reporting obligations they have. But nobody wanted to enforce it because it's like, well, but they're servicing our ships in the Philippines. If we cancel that contract, if we come down hard on, the complete lack of information security they have, then who's going to service our ships? And, we're running an exercise with the Filipinos. How are we going to do this? So I think a big challenge for policymakers is coming up with, yeah, I completely agree. We need the enforcement, but how do I design enforcement that does provide an incentive, but that doesn't end up getting US Indo-PACOM and a 4-star calling the White House and saying, why am I not doing an exercise with our Filipino partners? Because some asshole at the White House has said, we need to enforce this contractual requirement.
Sounds like a White House problem to me. I mean, I thought Cercia was supposed to fix all the back end of the data sharing. Honestly, I mean, this is where, I having, spent most of my career doing incident response, I will say I sort of have the same speech I gave to every CEO or GC during the beginning of an incident, which is no company gets in trouble for getting hacked. Companies only get in trouble for how they respond. So, put on your, and I don't say this anymore, but put on your big boy pants and lead and do what you're supposed to do, manage and lead a company. And so that's really the, part of what, and then as soon as a company gets through an incident, what I realize is every single executive understands cyber at a level. I mean, they're calling me the next, I get text the next day. I put MFA in every device, and they're all excited about all the new things they've done to secure themselves. So you're right that we need to make that moment. We need to create those sort of security moments beforehand. But what ultimately the DoD needs to do is take that 221,286 companies, as they've done, divide them into 3 tiers, but also realize what they in the sort of in the enterprise of DoD truly need. What is truly, sticky or sustain or strategically important to DoD, which is not 221,286 companies. It can't be, or else we're kind of in a world of hurt. And focus on those, and then do what DoD does best, which is pay for stuff. These are allowable costs. I mean, the government is the largest purchaser of IT in the world, and that means they should be the largest purchaser of InfoSec in the world. And we don't always translate those two things together.
Graduated enforcement. Penalties get bigger the more times you, I don't know. Anyways, I'm gonna take the prerogative of winding this down. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but I'm going to, because I didn't get to say the thing that I wanted to say in the beginning, which was thank you to Evan and to Crowell for hosting this event, and to Bryson and Josh and the community here. I was either at the first or the second one of these down the street in the Reagan building, and to see the amount of growth and community, it's great to see. The other folks I want to say thank you to are the team behind the scenes, so the team here at Crowell, but also, because I don't know all the team at other places, I know the team at IST. So Sophia and Lillian and Gigi, I just want to give you all and the rest of the team at IST a big round of applause. And Emily, one of the people at Crowell.
With that, I will begin my last thanks, which is thankfully still my good friend Randy and Megan for joining me on this odyssey. Yes, we'll be speaking again soon. So and thank you guys for having us. Appreciate it very much.